You had written and spoken favourably of the US relocating its embassy to Jerusalem. Given these events and the violence that we've seen in the past 24 hours, has that given you pause to reconsider that?
Well, the transfer of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem is a very reasonable and defensible thing to do on its own merits. Jerusalem is Israel's capital. It has been virtually since its founding. And where our new embassy is located is in West Jerusalem, which it could never conceivably change hands in any plausible two-state scenario. And so I have no concern about that decision on its own merits. My bigger concern was that the Trump administration, in announcing that and then implementing it, didn't connect it to the broader context of a plan for a two-state solution that ends the conflict and that Palestinians would also be able to achieve some of their objectives, including a capital of their own in East Jerusalem. Had they done so, it would have been much easier for Palestinians to absorb the decision. It would certainly have been smarter not to have the ceremony yesterday right in the middle of some of the most emotional days of the calendar, Nakba Day, as the Palestinians call it, commemorating Israel's founding when many Palestinians lost their homes, and the beginning of Ramadan. Had the embassy ceremony been conducted at a different time, it would have done less to fuel these protests. So I don't think the violence is directly connected to that embassy transfer. I think the embassy transfer on its own merits is defensible. I think it was handled quite poorly by the timing, but also by not connecting it to that broader context of a two-state solution.
You had said that that move of relocating the embassy, with the potential, as you've rightly pointed out there, you've also raised the potential for recognising East Jerusalem as a Palestinian capital, could bring the parties back to the negotiating table for a two-state solution. But as we have seen with the violence, with Hamas calling out people to protest, with the response from Israel, this goes precisely to the intractability of this issue, doesn't it?
Indeed. There's no serious chance of negotiations anytime soon. We know the leaders on both sides very well. President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority is near the end of his political career. He's old and not in great health. He's got succession politics to manage. He has his rivalry with Hamas, which of course rejects Israel's very right to exist. And Prime Minister Netanyahu on the Israeli side leads a very right-wing government, dominated by voices who oppose a two-state solution very openly. He's also embroiled in a number of corruption investigations which limit his political flexibility. So in fairness to the Trump administration, there's no serious prospect of a negotiation anytime soon. And that creates opportunities for extremists like Hamas to try to appeal to the Palestinian public to follow their lead in the use of violence. Then, of course, it's a question of how Israel manages those events at the border, some involving violent incidents, some involving unarmed protesters in a very chaotic situation.
Now, you did say before that you don't believe that moving the embassy as such is a contributor to this violence, and I don't want to sort of paraphrase you out of context there, but there's a reason, isn't there, that Barack Obama, whom you served, did not move the embassy. There's a reason that George W. Bush did not move the embassy. In a volatile situation, wasn't this precisely predictable? That yes, moving the embassy, the date of this today as well, was all going to bring this to the boil?
Well, President Clinton, President Bush, the son, President Obama, and even President Trump at the beginning of his term did use the waiver authority in the legislation that mandates moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. The logic for doing those delays in those years was that there were ongoing negotiations, or at least attempts to restart negotiations. And so the idea of moving the embassy without those negotiations having reached the point where it was logically connected to their results might disrupt the very negotiations. There have been no negotiations in over 3 years, closer to 4 years, and there's no prospects of negotiation. So I think it's a very different calculus. To me, the issue is whether or not we use this decision, again, a correct and defensible decision on its own merits, to advance our strategic objective. What's our strategic objective? It's not where the U.S. Embassy sits, and it's not even just to end violence. Obviously, we want to end violence, but the strategic objective is an end to the conflict. And there's only one way the conflict comes to an end. That's a two-state solution in which both Israelis and Palestinians achieve statehood, security, recognition, their own capitals in East Jerusalem. Obviously, it means relief for the long-suffering people of Gaza, which will ultimately mean Hamas will have to be removed from power as well. Those are all the things that we should be keeping our focus on, and that is where a defensible decision on its own merits has not yet been adequately connected to that strategic objective.
Was there a risk here, though, that in moving the embassy, you call the defensible decision, also then says that the United States is not the honest broker, is not someone that can bring both sides together, it is showing a preference?
Well, one thing it did do was it busted an important myth. There is a myth that is too frequently trafficked by the Palestinian side that says there's no historic Jewish and Israeli connection to Jerusalem. They have no legitimacy to be there. It's important to set the record straight and recognize certain historical facts and certain realities. There's another myth that we should have busted at the same time, and I'm certain over time will be busted by, if not this administration, a future U.S. administration, and that is that there's any such thing as an end to this conflict that doesn't include a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. So it is true that by making the decision disconnected from that broader context and broader vision, it has really brought a rupture to the United States administration's ability to talk with the Palestinians. That's also hampered them from presenting the peace plan that they've been working on for over a year. So again, you can make a good decision and implement it poorly, and I think that's the situation that we found ourselves in this week.
Is there a question now of accountability after the events of today? Israel, and we'll deal with that question first, and then the Palestinians. Israel today and the question of a proportionate response. More than 50 people dead. If you look at the roll call of the ages of people, 15, 16, 17, 18, many young people among this. What is the criticism, what is the response to this today from Israel, Israel's actions and the way that it's handled this?
It's very difficult to judge the use of force and its appropriateness in a given situation from afar. These are very chaotic events. There are clearly unarmed individuals who are protesting in a way that is perfectly legitimate to do so. There are clearly also violent people who are shooting at the fence, trying to destroy the fence. Their stated goal is to breach the fence, in fact. So it's a very chaotic situation. It's intentionally so because Hamas is a terrorist organization that has long fought its battles embedded within a civilian population, seeks to create that kind of confusion. The American military has dealt with analogous problems in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and our commanders have struggled, as any military that also has the democratic values behind it, about how to minimize the cases of civilian casualties when fighting a legitimate adversary that the use of force is required against. I can't judge individual cases. Obviously, no one should be satisfied. Certainly, nobody should be callous about the notion of civilians being killed, and especially children being killed. And my advice, as our military's advice has always been to the Israeli government, is to whatever efforts you are making to prevent civilian casualties, and I do think the Israeli military makes many efforts, they have to be redoubled, and they have to be redoubled again, precisely because they're fighting an enemy that almost welcomes civilian casualties because of the propaganda value they bring.
And we have just under a minute left, but what is the advice then to Hamas, who were calling for people today to try to breach that border and protest?
You know, in recent years, Hamas has actually demonstrated the ability to enforce the limits at that fence. After the ceasefires of the conflicts of 2012 and 2014, Hamas, which has very stable control of events in Gaza, was able to enforce those limits, was able to enforce other groups from firing rockets, etc. I think Hamas is under great pressure. They've lost essentially the ability to fire rockets at Israel because Israel has missile defense. They've lost the ability to use their tunnels because Israel can detect them. And now they've resorted to using their own people as the means of restoring their own relevance and a source of influence. I think that's very cynical. I think it's very dangerous. Obviously, I think it needs to stop.
Dan Shapiro, good to talk to you. Thank you so much.